Welcome to another edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. My name is Aljamal Rashad Binding. I'm the chair of the Moore Board of Directors, and we do a number of events, and we share a lot of community events that help people to deal with some of the contemporary issues in our community as well as international issues. In this edition today, we have Dr. Patrick Velasquez, who I've known for many years. He's originally from Omaha, moved out to San Diego over 35 years ago or so, and was working at one of the local universities, and he'll talk more about that. But he's been very much involved in student retention and achievement, and he's also, when he was in Omaha, he was very much involved in running the local Latino center, which back in the day was called Chicano Awareness Center. And that's where I met him back in those days. Also, we met in graduate schools where we both were taking an education class, and that's how we developed our warm and long-term friendship of dealing with these issues. So without much further ado, Patrick, I'd like to start off by saying, can you share with the viewing audience a little bit more about yourself? And then we'll move into the questions. We're going to talk mainly about Cuba and the book review and so on. So take it from there, my friend.
Okay, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon to everybody, and thank you, Ajamal, for the invitation to be here today. As you mentioned, I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, and my grandparents immigrated to Omaha from central Mexico back in the early 1900s. They were some of the first Chicanos, or people of Mexican origin, to be in South Omaha, and they worked in the meatpacking industry that was really big then. So they moved out of, my parents moved to North Omaha. Actually, I was born and raised there and attended public schools, graduated from North High School, went to UNO. So got all this education without going probably more than 4 or 5 miles from my house, and graduated from UNO with a bachelor's degree in social work, and then went back to UNO for a master's degree in education where we met. And then about 34 years ago, I moved to San Diego, California, and I've been living here in San Diego ever since. I had been out of school after my master's for about 10 years, and then I went back and completed a PhD in higher education. And I spent 28 years working at the University of California, San Diego, which is a selective research institution, part of the system of higher education, public higher education in California. Very, very racist institution. So had a lot of struggles and battles there for 28 years, and retired about 5 years ago, and I'm still active in the San Diego community with all kinds of issues related to Chicanos in higher education. And as we're going to talk about today, I developed a research interest in Cuba several years ago, and have been pursuing that ever since.
Good, good. Appreciate it. Now, what is your personal connection with Cuba? Again, as a Chicano, what do you see as the points of connection between the solidarity between the Chicano community, the U.S. Black community, and Cuba? I know this is something you've been working on, but give me a little bit more insight to that question, or
You know,
those
it
questions.
actually started back in the 1970s when I was a young Chicano activist, a student activist at UNO. And, at that time, my friends and I, as we talked about issues and the community's needs, we realized that we really had a need for strong Chicano leadership, not only in Omaha, but in the whole United States, national Chicano leaders and so forth. And when we happened to see Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and some of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution on television or in documentaries, we were pretty astounded because we said, man, these guys, they're not exactly like us. They're not Mexicans, they're Cubans, but we certainly share a background. They speak Spanish, and we have some cultural similarities. And the interesting thing was the way that they stood up to the United States. And they told the leadership of the United States to go to hell, that Cuba was a sovereign country, and to keep their hands off of Cuba and let Cuba determine its own destiny. And we thought, wow, this is the kind of message that as Chicanos we need to be giving to all these white racists that we see running Omaha, that we have our own community and we want to have self-determination and empowerment and emancipation of our communities.
Mm-hmm.
So in a nutshell, Fidel, Che, the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, were an inspiration to us, and something that We just felt intrinsically, naturally. The other interesting thing I believe is, in my opinion, Cuba, for all practical purposes, I would call it a black country. A lot of people, I think, I imagine, I would speculate that even a lot of African Americans in the United States would look at Cuba and think, oh, it's a Spanish country that's kind of like Mexico. But although, in the same way that Mexico is primarily an indigenous country, the people there are primarily indigenous. Um, the culture and the heritage of Mexico is much more indigenous than it is Spanish or European. In Cuba, it's the same sort of thing, but with African presence.
Mm.
Most of the people there I would consider as black or African origin. Um, they have an expression in Cuba that says, si no tiene de Congo, tiene de Carabalí, which means if you don't have an ancestor from the Congo in Africa, you probably have one from the Calabar region of Africa. In other words, everybody in Cuba is African to some degree. And I think, for African Americans here in the United States, there's some really important lessons to be learned about the way that Afro-Cubans have maintained African culture and African religion under the most difficult circumstances. And they still continue to do that. And I don't mean like just having awareness of African culture or religion, for example, or just having it on display in a museum, but I'm talking about living the culture on a daily basis. And many Afro Cubans and even non Afro Cubans are still struggling to make that happen on the island.
Wow. You know, I know you've been to Cuba a number of times. What has been your experience visiting Cuba, and how strong is the awareness among Cubans of the struggle of people of color in the United States?
I've had the pleasure, the privilege, I would say, of visiting Cuba a total of 9 times now, going back to 2007. The most recent time I was there was in 2020, just before the pandemic started. I've been there to do research and to gather information primarily about the educational system of Cuba, which I've written about and I've taught about. I taught courses at UC San Diego on Cuba's educational system. So when I went to Cuba, I presented at conferences, I presented at symposia, talking about the experiences of Chicanos and people of color here in the United States. And I've had a chance to interact with Cuban scholars. On one trip in 2015, I went with a group of about 30 educators from the United States. And we spent a week in Cuba immersed in their educational system. So I was able to visit high schools, technical schools, universities. I was able to go into classrooms and talk with students and teachers, faculty, and also talk about some of the central administration of the educational system in Cuba. It is pretty centralized. I also really fulfilled a dream of mine by, on 2 separate occasions, taking a group of about 15 UCSD students, undergraduates, to Havana, Cuba for a week. Almost all Latino students. Most of them had never been out of the United States before. So we traveled to Cuba for a week and interacted with Cuban professors that taught about Cuban history, culture, government, economic system, etc. So that was a great experience. And in terms of their awareness, I find that the Cuban people are so aware of almost everything, man, outside of the island, which is incredible, especially when you think about the availability of the internet in Cuba is not very widespread. Yet people seem to know a lot, not just the academicians there and the scholars, but even the folks at the grassroots level, the taxi drivers, the hotel security guards, and so forth. So there's a lot of awareness, I would say, of national, international events, so much more so than the ignorance that you find among people here in the United States, particularly white people. And when you consider the access that white people have in the United States to information and education, it's shocking how ignorant they are in comparison.
Mm. In 2021, I think Aldir Ferreira, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, a Cuban American scholar from New York University, wrote a historical text called Cuba and American History. Can you give us somewhat of a brief summary of Ferreira's text on Cuba? By the way, I saw that she got a number of awards and prizes for that book. So give us a little bit more background on that, Patrick.
So this is the book, as you said, Cuba, An American History. It's a little daunting to briefly summarize a historical text that starts in 1492 in Cuba and goes all the way up to the Obama administration in the election of Donald Trump in 2016. But there's a lot of good information in the book. I would say that just as sort of an editorial commentary on the book, the author, Ada Ferrer, is a Cuban American. She was born in Cuba, and then her parents took her out of the country. They all left the country after Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959. And like a lot of Cubans from that period of time that had that experience, her parents were obviously well off amongst the higher socioeconomic class in Cuba. And they left and they hated the Castros and the Cuban government ever since. So I think the author's biases against the Cuban government are apparent, but there's still a lot of good information in the text. And I would say that overall, the prevailing theme in the book is the tensions throughout Cuba's history in their struggle against Spanish colonialism, which started with Christopher Columbus. You know, Columbus never touched the United States, as we know, but he did make it to Cuba thinking it was China. And from that period of time, the Spanish colonized Cuba and colonized it for about 400 years. And it wasn't until almost 1900 when Cuba was able to overthrow Spanish rule. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, I think there's also the tension in the United States colonialism of Cuba after the Spanish colonialism. And again, I think one of the critical themes of the book, in a nutshell, is the way that slavery, the institution of slavery, contributed to capitalism in Cuba and capitalism in the United States. So almost from the earliest days in Cuba, when the Spanish ruled the island, United States corporations and individuals were involved in helping to set up and maintain the slave industry, the slave trade in Cuba, and to start the sugar industry. So that became Cuba's national crop, sugar. They became the biggest producers of Cuba of sugar in the world, and it was all dependent on slave labor. So this repeats a historical theme that you and I have talked about before, in which the phenomena, the unfortunate, very sick phenomena of slavery, genocide, and land theft against native peoples, the theft of Mexico's national territory, all these things contributed to the building of United States capitalism, both in the United States but also in Cuba as well.
I most people in the United States have a slight awareness, Patrick, of Cuba through Fidel Castro, which many of us admire, in his successful revolution in 1959. And by the way, I had a kind of a student teacher, a practice teacher who was from Cuba and was very progressive and educated me on some of the stuff they went through. How accurate is the stereotype perpetrated by the U.S. media and even white liberals as Cuba as what we call, quote, a communist dictatorship? Because you hear a lot of that in the media, which is a shutdown for a lot of people to learn more about Cuba. But talk to me a little bit more about that.
Well, it's not a accurate stereotype. It's very much is the stereotype though, and it always makes me shake my head and wonder. You know, every time that I see in the newspaper the reference to Cuba as a communist government, and I see this all the time in the media, the communist government of Cuba. That's an oxymoron. Communism is not a government.
Right.
Communism is a theoretical economic system that really doesn't exist. It's like an idealized form of economy that Karl Marx and some of the other theorists of communism developed. Cuba has a socialist economy, although it's becoming more mixed. I've seen that in the more recent visits that I took to Cuba, where people are allowed to operate private restaurants, private businesses In the old days, after the revolution, that was not the case. There is a one-party political system in Cuba, only one party, the Cuban Communist Party, but they do have elections. They do elect people, representatives to the National Assembly of Cuba, which ultimately picks the president of Cuba, then the leadership. So the part of the ignorance of people in the United States, including our leadership, was that when Fidel Castro finally died, the Cubans would change government and change their way of thinking, and everything would be great for the United States. And that was crap, man, because they have a system of electing leadership. The president of Cuba is Diaz Canel is his last name, and he has no relationship to the Castro family. So I know a lot of people would argue, well, what good is it? Is it democracy if you have a one-party system? My response would be, it's not very good as in terms of democracy. It's not a democratic system when you have a two-party system like we have in the United States, especially when both parties are owned and controlled by wealthy whites. And I think it was Che Guevara, in fact, who said that our two-party political system in the United States is like a pig with two heads, with both heads eating out of the same bowl. And of course, the bowl is the United States corporate world, the
Right.
corporations that make donations to the campaigns of both Democratic and Republican candidates. So this metaphor of our system as a two-headed pig with both pigs eating out of the same trough is very accurate. I would add that Cuba cannot afford to have an open political system with elections, because all you have to do is look at history, and we know for a fact that if they tried to do that, the United States would interfere with the system. They would corrupt the system. They would back candidates friendly to the United States, and Cuba would no longer look the way it does right now. And
Wow.
you think that anybody who thinks that that's not true or it's an exaggeration, any United States citizen right now, even as we speak, any citizen of the United States can submit a grant application to the U.S. aid, AID is called, and you can apply for funds to essentially try to overthrow the Cuban government. So the United States government today provides funding to our own citizens that are interested in overthrowing Cuba's government. So anyway, that's where we're at with that right now. And so I think we can talk some more about the system in Cuba, but that's essentially some of the salient points.
Patrick, one of the things that I'm aware of is that we know that U.S. imperialism and hostility to Cuba was ramped up after Fidel became the leader of Cuba, but how strong was U.S. colonization of Cuba long before the 1950s?
Well, as I said, I think the United States has been deeply involved in Cuba all throughout the 400 or so years of Spanish rule. And the Cuban people finally overthrew Spanish rule in 1898. But it's pretty much the case that the day that the Spanish were thrown out of Cuba, the United States military moved in. Now, we know about the so-called Spanish-American War, in which the United States military helped Cuba to defeat Spain. But then again, the military came in and they said that they were going to occupy Cuba until they thought that Cuba was capable of governing itself.
Wow.
And then in 1901, a couple of years later, the United States Congress passed something called the Platt Amendment. This was federal United States legislation, not in Cuba, but here in the United States. The Platt Amendment, much like the Monroe Doctrine in the 1800s, the Platt Amendment unilaterally gave the United States the right to intervene militarily in Cuba's affairs whenever it wanted to.
Wow.
Well, they could come in and take over the government or the economic system whenever they wanted it. That Platt Amendment also said that the United States had a right to set up a United States military base in Guantanamo, Cuba, on the eastern part of the island. This was not a military base for the Cuban people owned by the Cuban government. This was a United States military base. And the rationale was that the US needed it for national security. The United States still occupies that military base in Guantanamo, Cuba. Even though Cuba does not want us there, even though it's a violation of international law. And I think we heard, in years following 9/11, how the what was called Gitmo, the prison for Middle Eastern suspects that was set up in Guantanamo because they didn't want them here in the United States. So by 1907, three-fourths of Cuban land was occupied by foreigners, and most of that was in the United States. Now, in 1959, if we jump way ahead, Fidel Castro and the other Cuban revolutionaries overthrew the dictator, one of the most evil, corrupt dictators in Latin American history, Fulgencio Batista. So they overthrew the Batista dictatorship. And one of the points of Ferrer's book is that oftentimes, and I agree with this, oftentimes when we talk about Cuba and even the Cuban Revolution, we tend to overemphasize Fidel Castro, whereas it was a popular revolution of the Cuban people. And although Castro and Che and so forth fought out of the mountains in the Sierra Madre section of Cuba, there were urban revolutionaries all throughout Cuba. And so it was a collective effort demanding change and demanding an overthrow of the government. So when Fidel came in with the new government, they nationalized a lot of property and businesses that were owned by the United States. They broke up these obscene amounts of land that wealthy Cubans had and did a lot of reforms that were demanded by the Cuban people. And of course, this pissed off the United States leadership, and a lot of the wealthy Cubans left the island and went to places like Miami, Florida. Then, of course, the other chapter in this whole saga of United States imperialism was 1961, when we had what's called the Bay of Pigs incident, when the CIA and President John Kennedy sponsored a United States invasion of Cuba.
Right.
Now, again, Cuba had committed no act of hostility against the United States, but they were joined. The CIA was working with a group of these wealthier Cubans who had left. They wanted to go back and overthrow the Castro government. So they invaded Cuba. Fortunately, their invasion failed miserably. And all that did was just provide irrefutable proof to the Cuban people of United States hostility toward the Cuban government.
Wow. As you were sharing that, like I alluded to earlier, the woman who was like my practicum student teacher when I was in undergraduate in education, was her family was one of those refugees that were left. But the other thing is she was very supportive of Castro. She also talked about the elitism and the corruption that went on with the Batista government, as well as if you watch that movie about, was it Robert Redford was in Havana, you can see some of the reasons why people did that. The other issue you just made, that many people of African descent or African Americans or people of color fail to understand that when you have a popular revolution or people are doing that, particularly Cuba, it isn't the one personality or the cult of the personality of Fidel Castro. He had to have a lot of support. And as Dr. Imani said in one of our previous shows, we got a lot of leaders running around here, but no followers. So they're just icons in our community or self-appointed sages that have no substance. So Cuba could not have done what they've done if there was not that mass support to push back, in spite of all those reactionary Cubans who live in Florida who are more concerned about losing their wealth because it was nationalized. And the joke was many of them lived in houses that after Fidel took over, he made them school buildings. They were that rich, so very much so. I want to ask you a little bit about, after the 1959 Cuban Revolution, we know that there are a lot of African Americans who've gone to Cuba. And how did Cuba support the fight for Black liberation during the 1970s? There's still some people there who left the United States as exiles because the FBI and the CIA was after them, trying to assassinate if they've done other African American leaders. But talk a little more about Cuba's support for Black liberation movement in the United States after the 1970s.
Yeah, there's I think always been, since the revolution in 1959, there's always been a deep interest on the part of Cuban people in all kinds of other liberation movements throughout the world and wanting to support those. And so certainly they look to somewhere as close as the United States. And I meant to mention that when we were talking about my early interest in Cuba, I also learned that there were Chicano leaders like Jose Angel Gutierrez, whose name is probably not known to a lot of folks now, but was one of the national leaders of the Chicano movement in the 60s and 70s. And he visited Cuba during that time. So did Luis Valdez, one of the drama scholars and literary scholars in the Chicano movement. And you had something called the Venceremos brigades, Venceremos meaning basically we shall overcome. And these were groups of Chicanos who were going to Cuba to visit, to learn about the Cuban system and to help in any way they could. And there were also similar visits from African Americans, activists, civil rights activists in the United States that went to Cuba. And as you say, there are a number of African American and civil rights activists that were facing trumped up phony charges in the United States, and they fled to Cuba. There's a book called Shakur, Asada Shakur,
Hmm.
who was one of those who went to Cuba. I believe might still be there, as I
They're still
understand.
there.
Yeah, there's still right now with the Biden administration. There's some minimal dialogues taking place between the Biden administration and Cuban officials. But the Biden administration is still pressuring Cuba to give up Shakur and any other African Americans that have been there for decades, even though the charges have been discredited by now. That you still have that phenomenon exist. So um, we can talk also about in the 1970s that the Cuba government supported Angola in southern Africa. Angola was fighting for independence. And as I understand, South Africa, the white South African government was trying to essentially annex them. And so Cuba's military support and philosophical support was very important to helping Angola preserve their independence and achieve victory. And it helped to limit the apartheid of the white South African government. Again, this is part of the Cuban leadership's consistent ongoing support for liberation movements throughout the world. And I think it's important to realize this support is not just in terms of military, but also in terms of things like medicine and providing doctors. One of the times when I was in Cuba, my taxi driver I was with passed by medical school, and he told me it was primarily a medical school for students from Africa. That different African countries would send their medical school students to Cuba in order to earn their medical degrees there. And that of course it was a lot more accessible to them than any place else in the world. So Cuba still has that same commitment. I met people from other Latin American countries like El Salvador and Venezuela that were there in Cuba studying and for free, basically,
Wow.
and trying to learn about the Cuban system and basically how they do things.
Well, Patrick, the other thing is I remember when Mandela came to the United States and Ted Koppel tried to take him to the woodshed, and Mandela reversed it when he was Koppel was trying to say that he should disavow Fidel Castro Cuban support, and Mandela basically says, just because he's your enemy doesn't mean he's necessarily my enemy, and that Cuba was very instrumental in supporting the South Africans during their liberation. And again, we know that the Cubans had a lot of medical doctors who helped in some of those conflicts and issues in Southern Africa and so on. So again, one of the things that we failed to understand is that Cuba contributed a lot to the African support, and they have a great credibility with Mandela and other South Africans, because again, when the United States was busy turning Mandela in, the CIA snitched on him and told the South African Boers a racist apartheid government where he was at, and that's how he got captured, using some of the United States satellite images and so on was part of that. I want to switch up and ask you a little bit today. We're a little bit more contemporary. Today, how does U.S. policy affect Cuba and Cuban people currently who are to look at this embargo that we have? And then we also have the U.S. occupation, as you alluded to earlier, Guantanamo Bay, where they tortured a lot of people who were involved in the Afghan conflict and issues. What has the United Nations done to help with this U.S. embargo, but also going back to how has U.S. policy impacted Cuba and the people today dealing with all those issues that we're facing?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most important part of our discussion today. The history is important, but the embargo is, to me, the key issue when it comes to Cuba and U.S. policy. So after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, the United States would shortly thereafter impose an embargo on Cuba. And what that means is that the United States not only severed diplomatic relations with Cuba, but also refused to trade with Cuba and pressured all the United States allies to not trade with Cuba as well. So there are shortages of almost everything in Cuba as a result of that: food, medicine, and so forth. In the 1990s, the embargo was strengthened by legislation passed by the United States Senate, signed into law by that corrupt, racist Bill Clinton. And that was part of his legacy of racism and imperialism. Just an example of how that affects people. One of my friends in Cuba that I email from time to time told me that shortly after the pandemic started, that there was a ship from Cuba, I'm sorry, from Europe, bringing medicine and vaccines to Cuba to help fight COVID. And the United States intercepted that ship and made it turn around and go back to Europe, would not allow it to deliver medicine to Cuba, to the Cuban people.
Wow.
So these kinds of things are not hurting the leadership of Cuba, they're hurting the Cuban people. And so it's very important to understand the goal of the United States embargo. The goal is to starve the Cuban people, to literally starve them and make their conditions so miserable that out of sheer desperation, they will overthrow the Cuban government, and then the United States can swoop in and install somebody that's more favorable to them. This has not worked for about 60 years now. It has not worked. It will not work. All it does is just bear testimony to the unspeakable cruelty of white society in the United States. I would add that for 30 years now, every year for 30 years, the United Nations has taken a vote on the United States embargo against Cuba. The most recent vote, I believe, was in 2021. And the countries of the United Nations voted overwhelmingly in favor of a resolution that condemned the embargo. So 185 countries condemned the embargo. Only two countries, the United States and Israel, supported the embargo.
Wow.
And yet the United States, a charter member of the United Nations, refused to obey that vote and tear down, deconstruct the embargo. And as I said, they still continue to occupy Guantanamo, a blatant violation of international law. So, we can talk all day about Cuban policy and the degree of freedom that people have in Cuba, as if we have freedom as people of color here in the United States. But the key fact is there's only one country in the entire world against which we impose an embargo like this, and it's Cuba.
Wow.
Cuba, a country, again, that has never committed any act of hostility toward the United States, and we are embargoing them, trying to starve the Cuban people. We do not have an embargo against North Korea, despite their threats against us and our allies in the region. We do not have an embargo against Saudi Arabia, a country that has no shred of democracy, that literally chops up its enemies in pieces. We have no embargo against Russia, even though Russia interfered in our electoral system and is now conducting an illegal war in Ukraine. The United States would never, ever impose an embargo like this against a predominantly white country. Never. But because Cuba is a black country, they feel empowered to do so.
Wow. Patrick, I'm kind of startled by the history of how people don't know some of this stuff because our media and our plantation educational system doesn't teach some of this. One of the questions that I guess comes to mind is, has U.S. hostility towards Cuba changed in recent history as the U.S. leadership has changed? And again, we talk about Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and so on. are local politicians, U.S. senators, Congressmen, a potential asset, or can they help deal with the problematic policy we have towards Cuba today? In other words, are there enough clear-headed people with all these changes to make it better?
Well, if you look at the trajectory recently, the George W. Bush administration maintained all the sanctions against Cuba. And, Bush is a native Texan, very anti-Latino. And a lot of let's face it, the pressure to maintain hostility and an embargo on Cuba comes mainly from the what are often called the gusanos, the worms, the old Cuban American population in places like Miami, Florida. And so, in order to please them, to placate them, you have presidents like George W. Bush that continue to impose these hostile tactics against Cuba. When Obama took office, he made the asinine decision to appoint Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State, which of course paved the way for Donald Trump's election in 2016. And he allowed Hillary Clinton for 4 years to continue to impose the same racist imperialist stance toward Cuba that her husband, Bill Clinton, had imposed in the 1990s. Now, when Clinton left office as Secretary of State during the end of Obama's first term, and John Kerry came in as Secretary of State, then some positive things were done. And so Obama reestablished diplomatic relations with Cuba. He reopened the United States Embassy in Havana. He even visited Cuba for a short time. So this changed the course of policy that had been going on for decades. Unfortunately, when Trump came into office, he reversed all that. And then Biden, of course, Joe Biden, racist Joe Biden, centrist, middle of the road Joe. Of course, he's again implementing a centrist policy, continuing Hillary and Bill Clinton's policies, making idiotic statements, calling Cuba a dictatorship. All the while, he goes to Saudi Arabia and does fist bumps with their murderous dictator in Saudi Arabia. So there hasn't been a lot of change. It seemed like perhaps under Obama we were going to go back to a more positive path. Hasn't happened.
It's gotten worse, in other words.
For a while, I think, yeah. But again, we're probably back to the same policies of passive engagement, passive hostility, I should say, that the Clinton administration implemented.
Wow.
In terms of our elected officials at the lower levels, I can tell you in California we have two United States senators, Dianne Feinstein, who's about 200 years old, is of absolutely no use. I have to be careful because I'm elderly myself. I certainly have no business serving in the United States Senate, neither does she. And so she's useless in general, and certainly on this issue. We have a Chicano United States Senator, Alex Padilla, but to my knowledge, he's providing no leadership whatsoever on this issue. I don't even know if he has an agenda for Chicano communities.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's been very sad. And then certainly at the level where I live, my United States House of Representative person, Sarah Jacobs, is the daughter of a wealthy former professor of the university where I worked, UC San Diego. Irwin Jacobs contributed to the institutional racism of UCSD by numerous donations and poured millions into the political campaign of his granddaughter, Sarah Jacobs. So that's the way it is now in California.
Wow.
In 2022, you can buy a seat in the United States Congress if you're white and you have enough money. So we can't look to these folks, unfortunately, to make any changes, at least in the short.
And Patrick, same thing in Nebraska. We got Ricketts being appointed to the Senate because he donated to, the guy who's now the current governor. So again, we know how corrupt our system is, even in Nebraska, which is supposed to be a good place to live. But again, if you happen to be a person of color or low income, We're one of the only few states that rejected federal money for housing and things that could help low-income renters and people in their state. We talk about millions of dollars. Again and again, you got these conservative redneck governors and folks who act like they don't want to take federal money because they feel that if they give it to low-income people, they won't go to work in their industries where they again exploit people. What is going to a little bit more of the solution? What is the solution for U.S. policy towards Cuba? What can we do to reverse this foolishness or this embargo on all these things from your vantage point?
Well, as simplistic as it might sound, the solution for the United States government is simply to stay out of the internal affairs of Cuba. And if the United States leadership really feels like the socialist economic system of Cuba is the wrong path, just leave them alone and see what happens. Just let
Right.
the people determine their own destiny. Again, I know that it sounds very simplistic, but um, I really think that white folks in the United States should be much more preoccupied with preserving their own shred of democracy that we have in our country right now, instead of daydreaming about some mythological model of democracy that doesn't even exist here, and
Right.
then trying to impose it on a country like Cuba. The United States should focus on solving our own racism, on eradicating our own racial hierarchy, instead of worrying about race relations in countries like Cuba. So I think part of the process amongst us as people of color in the United States and communities of color is to raise our consciousness. Um, the handling or the way that the United States media addresses Cuba is just abysmal. Even if you turn on MSNBC, which is supposed to be the progressive national news outlet, their stance toward Cuba is the same as Donald Trump's. And so the media does such a horrible job of quote unquote educating people about what the real situations are in Cuba. I'm so grateful that I have had the opportunity to go there and dialogue with the people themselves and get a much more inside perspective. So I think we need to raise consciousness, and you know this better than I do, Ajamal, that a lot of times local Chicanos or African Americans struggle to think outside of our own immediate communities. And if we're going to think about our communities on the national level, as we sometimes do, we need to even expand that and think about who we should be having solidarity with on the international level as well. I think Cuba is one example of that.
Well, another issue, we're more involved in the South African project. And so one of the things I'm also looking at is how do you bring Africans from the continent of Southern Africa who experience colonization and racism in contact with African Americans who experience the same mentality of racism and segregation and apartheid type of Jim Crow laws and you name it, lynchings and all that, and have common understanding how we can challenge and push back the historical trauma that's been inflicted on our communities of color. We're getting kind of close to the end, and I wanted to kind of tie this back a little bit to you are one of the very few Latinos, Chicanos, person who's not only has scholarship but also has a foot in say on the ground, boots on the ground in the community of activists and social justice people. And I'm always asking this question to squeeze with the juice. My question is, from the perspective of the Chicano Latino today, how can we get folks? And again, we got a lot of folks sitting on the sidelines, the bystanders, and people who just can yap and do nothing. But how can we get folks to engage in public policy issues or discuss changes such as this topic or other topic on both the local, state, and national, or maybe international level? Because this is one of the gaping holes in our society. So how do we do that, Patrick, from your point of view?
Well, I think we have to take advantage of every opportunity necessary and have these kinds of conversations, even in places where it might be uncomfortable. And I'm not talking about trying to change white people's attitudes because I have no interest in doing that. But I'm talking about even in our own communities of color that, again, some people would say, well, why should I care about Cuba? I mean, I'm just concerned about my own neighborhood. And I think we have to emphasize that there's a link there, man. And the same racism that subordinates African Americans and Chicanos in the United States that's the same racism, the same people that are perpetrating imperialism against Cuba and African countries and every place where there are people of color. So if we don't begin to at least recognize these linkages and relationships, then I think we won't be able to provide the support that we need and to be able to think through what some of the solutions are. I wrote a paper on Cuba's educational system and some of the things that they do in education that I think would be very useful with the education of Chicanos here in the United States. And we suffer from a long pattern of underachievement in Chicano communities across the United States. So sometimes we have to, I hate the expression, but I guess we have to think outside the box and consider other kinds of alternative realities, maybe even in countries outside of our national borders. And so, I think we have to try to utilize every media source that we can and to spread information around. I get emails that are disseminated from an entity in Havana, Cuba called Casa de las Americas. And they take a strong interest in what's happening here in the United States, especially among communities of color. And they have an email newsletter, and I try to disseminate that to my contacts as well. So I think it's very important to try to maintain those levels of solidarity and just try to raise consciousness, but oftentimes before any action's feasible, we have to at least raise the consciousness even amongst ourselves.
Patrick Velasquez, Dr. Patrick Velasquez, we're at the end of our program, and I just want to give you a chance. Any closing comments or things that you want to share with the audience before we close out?
Yeah, the thing I think I would leave people is the same theme that we've been talking about. But one of the times when I went to Cuba, I was invited to present at a meeting of the Association of Cuban Historians. So there were a number of people there, and we had a long discussion about the parallels between Chicanos in the United States and the Cuban people in Cuba. And toward the end of the discussion, there was an older man in the audience, and he just thanked me for being there. And he said that it was probably hard for me to understand how important it is to have solidarity between Cubans and people of color outside the island. And he said, their struggle has been so ongoing. When you read Ferrar's book or any text on Cuban history, it's amazing the degree of struggle that they've had. They fought a 30-year war for independence against Spain, and then they battled for about 60 years against the United States to end U.S. colonialism in Cuba. And so there's a lot of material deprivation still in Cuba on the island. But man, the people are so strong in every aspect you can think of. And again, they will tell you, as they told me, that their solidarity with people like us is very important. And believe it or not, it does help their struggle.
Well, on that note, I really appreciate you sharing that, Patrick, as usual. And again, this is part of a series of conversations we will have. Book reviews is good, and we encourage people to read books because, as Carter G. Woodson argued, that if you want to hide something from certain people, you put it inside a book. So we need to learn from those ancestors, those people who come before us, how much they've struggled. And again, so for some of us, we may not have oral tradition, but we can read today and learn about that the struggles we have today are related to the trauma and the struggles we've had as people of color throughout the diaspora and throughout the world. So appreciate you being here with us today. And hopefully we can do another book review or other conversations that would help our communities research not only have unity, but also to, again, push back at the imperialism forces that operate inside the FBI, the CIA, and government, which has been totally against our liberation as people who are oftentimes in this caste system. So thank you very much for being with us today. I hope you can join us again, folks, another time. As we always end, may the force be with you, and Barocco.